The second presentation we have for today, and I'll just stop my sharing my screen, is from our CEO and founder of Mathspace. Actually, no, I'm going to have to share my screen because your slides are with me, aren't they? There you go. So, Mohamad Jebara is the founder and CEO of Mathspace. Prior to founding Mathspace, Mo was a partner at Optiva, Australia's leading derivative trading firm, where he headed up their index trading desk as well as leading the robot trader project. He left Optiva in 2010 to pursue his passion for teaching mathematics and believes strongly in the use of technology and data to empower teachers. All right, so I'm going to now hand over to Mo and he's going to take it from there.
Thanks, Craig. Can you just confirm you hear me okay? Craig, I might share my screen. I've got the slides in front of me as well. So that way I don't have to keep telling you to switch screens.
All good.
Cool. All right. Thanks for that intro, Craig. And it's really good to hear from you, Sally and Sam. Really enjoyed kind of hearing about the practical side. I always love going out to schools. It's a shame I couldn't be there in person with COVID strikes once again. But it's awesome to hear how you've been using Mathspace and Waypoints in the class. Okay, I'm going to try and go through this quite quickly. There's a lot to pack in, but I want to give a bit of time for questions at the end for anyone that wants to kind of hear more about the vision of how Mathspace is coming together. So I'll start with our mission. It kind of drives every decision that we make at Mathspace. We believe that every student can excel at mathematics with the right help at the right time, and we want to be the right help at the right time for every student. Really quickly about our product philosophy. It sounds like most people have had some experience with Mathspace, so I'll just go through this quite quickly, but it will give you an idea of how Mathspace and Waypoints kind of come together. So we really started with Mathspace based largely on the research from Benjamin Bloom on the famous problem that's now called the 2 sigma problem. So what he found, this was back in the 80s, he found that in a conventional classroom, you have your normal distribution of outcomes for students. If you shifted to a mastery-based learning environment where students only progressed after they had mastered previous concepts, you could get a 1 standard deviation improvement in student learning outcomes. And if you could go to 1 teacher per student, a 1-to-1 learning environment, he found that you could get a 2 standard deviation improvement in student learning outcomes. So kind of ever since this in the 80s, we know we can't afford to have a teacher for every single student to get these kinds of huge gains in learning outcomes. But what we have tried to do is how can we use the technology as a pathway to be somewhat closer towards having the teacher be available. So whether that's giving the teacher more data or giving a student that step-by-step support as they're going through. So that's really the initial philosophy behind Mathspace. So we think of adaptive learning, it's become a bit of a buzzword in math software, adaptive learning. We think of adaptive learning like to simplify it down to these 3 layers of adaptive learning, an outer loop, a middle loop, and an inner loop. I'll go through each of these really quickly. So the middle loop is what most people refer to when they say adaptive learning. And it just means that as students get questions correct, the adaptive software progresses them to work on questions that are harder. And as they get them incorrect, the adaptive software gives them questions that are easier. So this is what we call an adaptive task on Mathspace, where the questions within a set are being selected based on students' past responses. It's the simplest model, it's well understood, and most adaptive platforms tackle only really this loop, the middle loop. One of the major innovations at Mathspace and a lot of our early R&D was, as a teacher, that's not the only thing you're doing. It's not just, hey, dude, you got that question wrong, let me give you an easier one. You're doing a lot more help within a problem. As students are working through a problem, you're giving them feedback as they're going through. So we focused a lot of our early R&D efforts at Mathspace on this step-by-step support, and we're quite unique on all adaptive platforms on tackling what we call this inner loop within a problem based on the context that you're solving that problem. How can we give you the best next hint to get to that next step as you're going through? And Sally, I think, spent a bit of time really pointing out how that's been very helpful for her students using the hints as they're working through. Now the final loop, and probably one of the most difficult ones, is the outer loop. And this is where you say, does the student have the prerequisite knowledge to learn this subtopic? And this is really one of the things that we found at Mathspace is, sure, if you have the right question for a student, then we can give them really good help while they're solving that problem. But are we even in the right area? And I know Sam earlier pointed to a student who had gaps in grade 4 and 5. Is giving them questions and content to do on grade 8, are we doing the right thing by that student, giving them questions to work on grade 8? No matter how much step-by-step support you're stepping them through, you probably have to go take a real step back and say, what's the bigger picture here? And that's one of the problems and that we were trying to solve with Waypoints. In terms of how it's currently...
Sorry, Mo, just the audio is just cut out, but the audio is just cut out.
This is kind of what innovation looks like and how... Oh, sorry. Okay, hopefully I'm back. So this is a picture from Uzbekistan from when COVID struck and they needed to test everybody. So they decided, okay, let's get innovative and get them out to the football field and practice social distancing and get everyone with their masks on. And it's really kind of, for me, it was when I saw this image, I kind of went, it's a sad state that in the year 2020, that the only way we can assess students is by having them at the same place, at the exact same time, doing the exact same questions. And really, that's one of the things we said, we want to break all three of those things. They don't have to be in the same place. They don't have to be doing it at the same time. And they probably shouldn't be doing the exact same questions. We can get a lot better and more accurate with how we assess students without all the high stakes that come with this kind of pressure of everybody being compared to each other, all these performance-based tests. So I don't think I need to talk you through the harmful effects that it has on students. We used to look at building Waypoints about 18 months ago now. We said our vision with this is to replace the need for high stakes testing with something that continuously monitors student performance. Sam showed also in Waypoint pathways. I'll skip through this quickly. On the technology front, we work with a leading data science team to build this AI-powered outer loop diagnostic. And I'll let you kind of have a look at this to kind of get an idea of how it works behind the scenes. And then I'll talk to it just after you watch this play. Okay, so I'll tell you what each of those is and I'll play it again while I talk to it. So this is a knowledge graph of all the outcomes in the Australian curriculum from grades 3 to 10. And each of the, you can probably only just see it, those connections through them. They're a directed graph of, say, before you can do two-step equations, you must first know how to do one-step equations. And so we've got an arrow from one-step equations to two-step equations as an example. And those arrows, they also have strengths on those arrows. So they can be a direct relationship, such as one-step equations and two-step equations, where we can say, if you don't know how to do one-step equations, then you most certainly don't know how to do two-step equations. And vice versa. If you can do two-step equations, then absolutely you know how to do one-step equations. And that's a real direct relationship. And there's others that are a bit softer relationships. And so we'll put a connection between them, but the relationship between them is softer. So what's happening here is we have a student operating at a grade 3, a grade 7, and a grade 10 level. And this is Waypoints initially diagnosing. So this was the initial 100 questions that Sam talked about, where we are working out across the entire knowledge graph what students know and don't know from grade 3 through to grade 10. And we're inferring those relationships based on the strength of those connections. And we're learning more about this as more and more students are answering these questions. And one of the things that we can do now is actually reduce the size of that initial diagnostic. So I mentioned earlier in the chat that we're going to make it more focused. So you can focus on just the strand. So we're not trying to test just so much in that initial test. And then also we've been able to reduce the number of questions because we're able to find out more about the connections between those. So explain that again, when you see the lights flashing, that means we're selecting a question for a student. And as it gets more green, we know that that student's getting that answer correct, and we're propagating. Therefore, it means they also know this. And so we have quite an efficient way to work out what students know across the curriculum. Okay, let's how it works behind the scenes. You have that knowledge graph that I talked about. We run these mathematical models to say which node and which question will give us the most information about that student's knowledge across the entire knowledge graph. We update the graph with mastery, but we also update by how confident we are of that. So if they previously got something wrong and now they got it right, then maybe we move the mastery up, but we're still not that confident because they haven't consistently got it right, or haven't consistently got questions right in that area. And so that's updating in real time, and then we select the next question. Now, what we do is we don't just update it for that question, but we update it for that question and all related questions across the entire network. So each of these nodes has at least 5 questions in our bank, and we'll update for all the questions that are related based on those strengths of those relationships. And then when it comes time to pull that mastery report at the end, the nice graph of where the nice charts that Sam was showing, we basically say, okay, which questions are linked to a particular outcome in the Australian curriculum? And so it's kind of organized. You can think of it as organized like, oh, this set of questions is linked to that outcome. And we collate the mastery and confidence across that outcome to produce that number of do they know it, do they not, and what that means. And that boils down to a number in algebra, they're operating at a grade 6.3 level. So that's how that comes through. Now, one of the beauty of this is that with regular check-ins, so this is something we're asking teachers to run in their classroom, maybe 1 check-in per week. Sally mentioned Waypoints Wednesdays as a great way to do this. So a quick check-in once a week. The check-ins are at the moment just 5 questions, so it could be something that you just do as a warm-up to your class to settle them down. And then as they're doing these check-ins, we get the new filter for outcomes, and we're able to get the growth report of how they're growing over time. Okay, so I might pause there just to see any questions before I kind of talk about what's next. I see the chat has a few things in there, so maybe Craig, if there's anything that stands out, I'll let you moderate this question.
Yeah, no, these ones, I think we've sort of got them. Mitch just asked about the frequency of the growth check-ins.
Yeah, so we leave that, it's largely up to how you want to run it. Our recommendation is 1 check-in a week so they can get consistent growth, but a lot of people will kind of go make it 2 check-ins every 2 weeks. So because the check-ins are so quick, it really depends on how your classroom structures what works best with that, whether it's done as something that they do at home or whether you carve out some time. I think it works best when you're carving out a little bit of time in the classroom, because then you have that consistency across the board. And Sally and Sam might be able to talk to like practically how you've managed those check-ins in the classroom.
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly. I wouldn't do any more than 1 per week. Except, well, this week I changed topics. So I did 1 check-in for number and algebra to like finish, because we just finished doing linear graphs. So it was like, okay, show us all the knowledge that you've achieved in that topic. And then we're starting geometry. So I got them to do 1 check-in there just to sort of give us a new baseline as to where they're at before we start any of the geometry content. But that would be the only time I would sort of do 2 close together.
Perfect. Craig touched on this earlier, that at the moment the check-ins are on the strand level, so they're quite broad and often they're not focused because we've got 5 questions and they're not that focused. So this generally plays out where a student sees they've got a particular gap and they're able to go into Mathspace and practice that gap. So they've worked on that gap and then they want to check in, and the check-in, because it's so broad, it's against the strand, they might not get the questions related to what they worked on. So we're going to introduce soon the ability to check in on a particular outcome. So if you've practiced a particular outcome, you're able to focus your check-in on that particular outcome and be able to really ensure that the question selected on or around that outcome. we don't want it to be just focused on just that outcome, because we don't want it to be like, hey, I just practiced those questions, I'm getting those questions. It'll be on or around those outcomes. So there's a bit of that variation that comes in as well, which is important.
The other one, Mo, that might be interesting to mention as well is, I don't know if Sam's kids have had this experience, but when they get past initial diagnostic, the initial 100 questions, which is limited by the year level, one year level past what the students say they're in, once they get to the growth check-ins, that upper barrier is dropped. And students will actually get a really challenging question, about 1 in 15, 1 in 20 of the growth check-ins questions they do. Can you explain a little bit about why that is? What's the purpose of that really challenging question?
Yeah, we've got some feedback where sometimes like, hey, my student in grade 7 just got a grade 10 question. What's going on there? So what we do with that, one in every 20 questions is completely random. And the reason why it's completely random is we use that to calibrate the models. So when we're throwing in that random question, we're all mathematicians here. I can talk about this. It's awesome. When we're choosing the questions that are adaptively, so the algorithm is selecting it in machine learning models, effectively you've introduced some bias in terms of estimating whether a student will get that right or wrong. When we throw a completely random question that's not chosen by the algorithm, we're able to check the machine learning algorithm to say, if on a random question, how does our algorithms perform? So we say, okay, we estimate that there's an 80% chance that they get this question correct, the random one, based on our models. And then we compare that to reality. And then that's how we calibrate our machine learning models to say that our estimates were, we thought 80% chance that they'll get that right. Across the tens of thousands of students that are using Waypoints, we're able to then check how accurate is our model. Was it actually 80%? And that's how we improve the model over time. So that's why 1 in every 20 questions we throw a random one. It's good to be able to kind of talk to the mathematics behind it. There we go, a practical application of bias and stats and probability.
And
all right, shall I move on, Craig?
Yeah, I was going to say, the other thing, maybe just a very brief overview of, you may get into this at this stage, but a student's not asked every single possible question of every single possible outcome of every single possible skill. That's just not practical to do that. So in terms of how we know that students are able to, there's a bit of probability or that machine learning around it. So can you just give a very, it may not be an easy or quick thing to be able to explain, but just a little bit about how the probabilistic models sort of work in terms of that? Is there an easy answer to that?
Yeah, it's kind of what I explained when I showed that video of the knowledge graph. So it's that, like I mentioned, the one-step equations, two-step equations, really strong relationship. There's no need to ask a question on one-step equations if they got the two-step equations one correct. So we're able to, and that's how the efficiencies are kind of generated from that. The part that's getting exciting is now we're starting to get a lot of data where we're able to really improve the efficiency based on the usage, the data that's coming in. So as students use the software, we're able to say, and this is where the machine learning kind of really comes to the fore, is when a student gets a particular question correct in, let's say, two-step equations, it can tell us a lot about something that maybe we don't have as a direct relationship, but potentially, I'm just kind of talking a bit generally now, but combining like terms and that question on two-step equations. From all the history of the people that got that question right on two-step equations, we know that they also have a really, really good chance of knowing how to combine like terms. That's where the power of the data and machine learning comes in, that you're able to say, and you're able to make that test just a whole lot more efficient. So these relationships that are not kind of directly linked, combining like terms and two-step equations, just through the sheer power of the data, of the number of students coming through that are answering those questions right, that show that they also know this. It speaks a lot to like potentially how it's taught in schools, etc., that there are these kinds of links between them as well. All right. I'll move on and just leave a bit of time as well at the end for any further questions on some of the kind of what's next. So this is kind of one of the things that's coming this year, later this year. One of the things we're looking at is how we bring the two things together. How do we bring that outer loop, the waypoints, the whole skill. So this is actually an old screenshot of the Waypoints interface with the Mathspace textbook and the Mathspace learning environment of what you're working in at grade level in class. So you can see it here. What we're looking at is from Waypoint. So in Mathspace, you could be in grade 9 teaching chapter 2.07 using quadratic functions. And we know that there's a prerequisite standard for that, which is this. And we got that data from Waypoints that tells you that 19 students are ready to learn this because they've mastered the prerequisite standard, but 4 students have gaps in this prerequisite standard. So that's one of the big areas that we think that we can really improve how a teacher runs their classroom when, you know, I'm going to be teaching this to my year 9 class this week because that's what we're doing this week. But now you've got this extra bit of information. From Waypoints, I know that there's some students that have gaps. So how's that going to change the way you teach it? You know who these 4 students are. Do you want to get them to do some extra Waypoints activities to make sure that they cover this gap while you're working through it in a class? So that's one of the kind of exciting areas where we feel like the outer, the middle, and the inner loop are all starting to come together in a single product to really be the right help at the right time for every student.